All right, strap yourselves in because today we're diving headfirst into some seriously wild weather.
You guys sent over some pretty intense excerpts.
Yeah, we're talking hurricanes, tornadoes, those blizzards. The stuff that makes you glad to be inside.
Exactly. Mother Nature showing off a bit. But it's one thing to see these things on the news. That we're going deeper today.
Beyond the headlines, right into the heart of the storm.
Exactly. So we're going to break down the science behind them, how they work, why they're so powerful, and why knowing about that can actually help you stay safe.
All right, love that practical knowledge. So let's kick things off with hurricanes. The excerpts describe them as these massive spinning heat engines
Yep.
and fueled by warm ocean water. Can you break that down for us? What's going on there?
It's all about energy, right? It's
It is.
about how the energy is moving and transferring. When that warm ocean water evaporates, it's rising up, carrying all of that heat energy with it.
Okay, so the heat's hitching a ride.
It is. It is. And as that water vapor goes higher, cools in the atmosphere, it condenses back into liquid
Right.
and releases all that stored heat. Boom. That process creates some powerful thunderstorms, and when a bunch of them start swirling together, guess what you get? A hurricane.
Okay, so the warm ocean water is like the fuel for this whole engine.
Yeah,
And that evaporation condensation thing, that's what's really driving it.
that's it. That's the heart of it.
Makes sense. But what gets those storms spinning in the first place? That's always boggled my mind.
Yeah, that's where the Earth, the planet itself, comes into play. Specifically, something called the Coriolis effect.
Okay, the Coriolis effect. Now, I've heard of that,
Uh-huh.
but explaining it.
It can be tricky. It's like, imagine you're trying to throw a ball straight across a spinning merry-go-round.
Yeah.
So from your point of view, you're throwing it straight.
Makes sense, a straight line.
But someone watching from the ground, not on the merry-go-round, they're going to see it curve.
Because the merry-go-round is moving underneath the ball, right?
You got it. The same thing's happening with air masses in a hurricane. As the air rushes towards the center, the low-pressure center of the storm, that Earth's rotation makes it curve.
Wow.
And it curves to the right in the northern hemisphere to the left of the southern hemisphere. And this is constant. This curving motion creates that spiral pattern. Yeah, that's so classic with hurricanes.
So it's like the Earth itself is giving these storms a spin. That's pretty wild. Now, one thing that's always fascinated me about hurricanes is that eye of the storm. You see it on satellite, perfectly calm in the middle of all that chaos. What's happening there?
So that's actually a direct result of all that spinning we're talking about. As the air spirals inwards and upwards, eventually gets to a point where it can't rise anymore. So it starts flowing outward at the top of the storm, and that creates a zone of descending air right in the center.
Oh, okay. So it's like what goes up must come down.
Exactly. And the descending air, it's dry, relatively calm. That's why the eye seems so peaceful compared to the rest of the hurricane raging around it.
Okay, that makes sense. But I bet it's pretty deceiving. I mean, surrounding that eye is the eye wall, which is where all the worst stuff is, right? The most intense winds and thunderstorms.
Absolutely. You don't want to be caught in the eye wall. That's where all the air is rising, the fastest, the most powerful thunderstorms, the highest wind speeds. It's like the hurricane's engine running at full blast.
Oh, man. Yeah, so if you ever find yourself in the eye of a hurricane,
Right.
don't let the calm fool ya.
Don't get too comfortable, no.
The worst is yet to come. Speaking of the worst, let's talk about the impact of these storms. Obviously, we think wind damage, and that can be devastating, but the excerpts mention there's a lot more to it than just wind.
Right. A lot of people don't realize that. One of the most dangerous things with a hurricane is something called storm surge. Now, this isn't just a big wave, right? It's a rise in sea level caused by the hurricane's winds. They're pushing all that water towards the shore.
So it's like the ocean is literally being piled up against the coast.
Exactly. And this surge can be massive. We're talking 10, 15, even 20 feet or more above normal sea level. It's like a mini tsunami just inundating those coastal areas, causing widespread flooding, destruction.
That's terrifying. And that flooding can extend pretty far inland, right? It's not just a problem for folks right on the beach.
Nope, not at all. Hurricanes dump tons of rain, which leads to widespread flooding far from the coast. Rivers and streams overflow. Low-lying areas get inundated.
Wow.
And even if you're not directly in the path of the storm itself, you can still be impacted.
How so?
Well, think about it. Transportation gets disrupted, power outages, damage to infrastructure. All this stuff can have a ripple effect across the whole country,
Yeah, I hadn't thought about that.
affecting supply chains. Even the economy takes a hit.
So that's a good reminder that even if you don't live near a coast, Understanding hurricanes and being prepared is still really important.
Absolutely.
All right, so from these massive swirling hurricanes, let's shift gears a bit
Okay.
to something that's a little more localized, but just as intense, tornadoes.
Yeah, yeah.
The excerpts describe them as nature's most violent whirlwinds, and they really emphasized how unpredictable they are.
Yeah, and that unpredictability, that's part of what makes them so fascinating and so dangerous. They form within these powerful thunderstorms, supercells, which have these rotating updrafts. They're called mesocyclones.
Mesocyclones, now those are key to the whole spinning tornado
Oh,
thing.
they are, they are. Mesocyclones are basically giant rotating collars of air right in the heart of the thunderstorm.
Okay.
But to get a tornado, you need another ingredient, wind shear.
Wind shear. Okay, I'm not familiar with that term. What is that?
So wind shear is a change in wind speed or direction. It happens over a pretty short distance. Imagine you're standing outside and the wind's blowing from the south, let's say 10 miles an hour near the ground. But a few hundred feet up, it's blowing from the west at 30 miles an hour.
No, okay.
That difference in speed and direction, that's your wind shear.
So you basically got different layers of air moving at different speeds, different directions, all at the same time.
That's it. Now, think of it like this. That wind shear, it creates a rolling motion in the atmosphere, kind of like tilting a spinning top.
Okay, I can picture that.
And this rolling motion, it interacts with that rotating updraft of the mesocyclone,
Right.
and it
Yeah.
can make the whole system tilt, bringing the rotation from horizontal to vertical. And when that rotating column of air touches the ground,
Bam, you got a tornado.
tornado time.
Wow, so it's that combination, rotating updraft in the supercell, the wind shear, that creates the conditions for a tornado to form.
Exactly.
That's pretty amazing. And I imagine when that funnel cloud touches down, things can get pretty intense, right?
Intense is putting it mildly. Tornadoes have some of the strongest winds on Earth. Speeds can exceed 200 miles an hour.
Yeah.
And it's not just the wind itself, right? It's all the debris that gets picked up and flung around.
Right. The excerpts talked about debris becoming like a barrage of projectiles, basically. That sounds absolutely terrifying.
It is. Even small objects can become deadly missiles in those winds.
Yeah.
And because tornadoes are relatively small and they move so erratically, it makes them incredibly difficult to predict and to prepare for.
And we can't talk about tornadoes without mentioning Tornado Alley here in the U.S. Why is that particular region so prone to these powerful storms?
It's a perfect storm, so to speak. It's a bunch of factors coming together. You've got warm, moist air flowing north from the Gulf of Mexico, dry air pushing down from the Rockies, changes in wind direction with height, that wind shear we were talking about,
Right.
and it all comes together in the Central Plains.
Right, right.
And that creates a perfect environment for supercells to develop. And those supercells, that's where tornadoes are born.
So it's like all the right ingredients just converging in that one spot. Makes sense. Now, from swirling winds to something a little more chilly. Let's move on to blizzards. I mean, they might look beautiful with all the snow, the world turning white. But the excerpts emphasize that blizzards are a lot more than just heavy snowfall.
Right, you got it. Blizzards are about that combo heavy snow and strong winds. It's those winds that create the really dangerous conditions.
Yeah, the excerpts mention whiteout conditions. What are those exactly, and why are they so dangerous?
Imagine you're driving down a road, and suddenly you can't see more than a few feet in front of you because the snow's blowing so hard.
Oh, wow.
That's a whiteout. You can't tell the ground from the sky. It's incredibly easy to get disoriented, lose your way.
That sounds pretty scary. I can see how that would be a huge problem for drivers especially. But it's not just about visibility, right? There's also the wind chill factor.
Yeah, wind chill, that's a measure of how cold it feels on your skin when you factor in the wind.
Mhm.
So even if the air temperature itself isn't crazy low, strong winds can make it feel way colder.
Oh, yeah.
And that can lead to frostbite and hypothermia way faster.
Right, so a blizzard isn't just about how much snow falls. It's about the wind creating those whiteout conditions and then amplifying the cold with wind chill. Like a 1-2 punch of winter weather hazards. And it sounds like the impacts of a blizzard can be pretty significant even beyond those immediate dangers during the storm itself.
Absolutely. They can cripple transportation systems, road closures, flight cancellations. They can knock out power lines, which means no heat, no electricity.
Nice.
And they can disrupt those supply chains, making it difficult to get essential things, food, medicine, to the areas that need them.
Wow. So even if you love snow, a blizzard is a whole other ball game.
It is.
Being prepared isn't just for people in hurricane areas. It's important for anyone who might experience these extreme winter conditions.
You got it. Understanding the risks and having a plan can make all the difference when it comes to staying safe during a blizzard.
So we've covered three very different types of extreme weather here. Hurricanes drawing their energy from the warm ocean, tornadoes fueled by those powerful thunderstorms and wind shear, and blizzards where the wind turns snow into a major hazard. But even though they're so different, they all seem to share a few things in common. What do you think?
Yeah, I think you're right. One thing they all share is their raw power and how unpredictable they can be. We've gotten better at forecasting, but these storms, they can still change path, intensify really rapidly.
Right.
That makes them tough to prepare for, and they could all cause serious damage, major disruption, no matter where you live. So being prepared is key, no matter what.
It really highlights that, how we're not as in control of nature as we might like to think. And that brings us to another common thread, the potential link to climate change. The excerpts mention that there's growing evidence that a warming planet is influencing how often these events happen, how intense they are.
Yeah, it's a complex issue, but the science is definitely pointing in that direction.
Right.
As ocean temperatures rise, we're seeing more intense hurricanes.
Right, and I know changes in atmospheric patterns, like shifts in the jet stream, can also influence weather systems, potentially leading to more extreme events.
Absolutely. It's all connected.
Yeah, but we'll save that deeper dive into climate change connections for another time.
Definitely a whole other conversation.
For now, I think we've got a pretty solid foundation for understanding the basics of these three powerful storm types.
Yeah, the building blocks.
Yeah.
But we've only just scratched the surface. There's so much more to explore.
Oh, I know.
In the next part of our deep dive, we're going to go further. We'll delve into the impacts of these storms, from the obvious ones to some that are a little more subtle, and how they ripple through society in ways you might not even think about.
Okay, sounds good. It's a reminder that knowledge is power, and the more we understand about these forces of nature, the better prepared we'll be to face whatever Mother Nature throws at us. Stay tuned for part 2.
All right, welcome back to our deep dive into extreme weather. Before we jump into the impacts, there's something you said earlier that I wanted to touch on, that interconnectedness
Oh, yeah.
of these events that seem so separate.
Right, it's like a hurricane makes landfall, and suddenly we're talking about, inland flooding, supply chain problems, even like the economic fallout. It's like they don't happen in isolation, do they?
Not at all. Think of it like a web, right? You tug on one strand, the whole thing vibrates, the whole structure.
Oh, I like that.
Yeah, so take hurricanes, for example.
Yeah.
Most obvious impact, the coast, right? Wind damage, all that flooding from the storm surge.
Right.
But then you got the heavy rainfall, too.
Right.
And that can cause rivers to overflow,
Yeah.
like hundreds of miles inland.
Yeah, and that's not even taking into account the human side of things,
Yeah.
People being displaced from their homes, businesses shut down, the strain on resources.
Exactly. And those impacts, they can linger long after the storm's gone. We tend to focus on that immediate aftermath, but the recovery can take months, years, even decades in some cases.
It's easy to forget about that when you're just watching it on the news, It's all dramatic footage. We see the destruction,
Right.
but we don't always think about those long-term consequences.
Exactly, and that's why it's so important to really understand the full scope of these events. It's not just physical damage.
Right.
It's the social, the economic, even the psychological impacts, too.
So with hurricanes, we've got this cascade of impacts from the coast to inland areas, from the immediate aftermath to the long recovery. What about tornadoes? They seem more localized, but I imagine they can still be incredibly devastating.
Oh, absolutely. Tornadoes are known for that intense, focused power. They could level entire neighborhoods in minutes, leaving a path of destruction it's shocking, and heartbreaking.
The excerpts mentioned the debris, how it becomes like these deadly projectiles. I can't imagine the force it takes to turn everyday objects into basically weapons.
It's incredible. Wind speeds in a tornado, they can reach hundreds of miles per hour in some cases.
Right.
And when those winds pick up debris, trees, cars, pieces of buildings, it's a deadly hailstorm of shrapnel.
And because tornadoes can form and dissipate so quickly, that makes them really hard to prepare for, doesn't it?
That's one of the biggest challenges. We've gotten better at predicting the conditions that are favorable, but where they're going to touch down, exactly when, it's still really hard to pinpoint.
So having a plan in place, knowing where to seek shelter, being aware of the warnings, all of that's crucial.
Absolutely. And even if a tornado doesn't directly hit, a community, there can still be ripple effects. Think about power outages, road closures, disruption of essential services.
It's a reminder that even smaller scale events like tornadoes can have a big impact on a whole region. Now, let's shift gears one last time
Okay.
to our final weather extreme, blizzards.
Yeah.
We talked about those whiteout conditions and wind chill, but what about the broader impacts?
Blizzards are, I think, often underestimated
Yeah.
because they don't have the same visual drama as a hurricane or a tornado, right?
Hmm.
But the impacts can be just as severe, especially in areas that aren't used to dealing with heavy snow, extreme cold.
The excerpts mention transportation systems being crippled. I imagine that's a huge issue when you've got feet of snow piling up, roads becoming impassable.
It is. It is. Blizzards can bring entire cities to a standstill.
Wow.
Schools shut down,
Mm.
businesses, transportation networks. And for people who rely on public transportation or folks who just can't afford to miss work, it creates a real hardship.
And then there's the potential for power outages, which, I mean, that can be life-threatening when it's freezing.
Exactly. Blizzards can knock down those power lines, no heat, no electricity for days, sometimes even weeks.
Yeah.
And then you're looking at hypothermia, frozen pipes, all sorts of problems.
It sounds like with blizzards, it's not just about surviving the storm itself.
Right.
It's surviving the aftermath, too.
That's a good way to put it.
Mhm.
And as we've seen with all three of these weather extremes, the impacts, they're far-reaching, long-lasting.
Yeah.
They affect not just individuals, but whole communities, entire regions.
Okay, so we've covered the science behind these storms, we've explored their impacts, and we've even touched on that potential link to climate change. What's next in our deep dive?
Well, I think it's time to get practical.
Okay.
In the final part, we'll shift gears and focus on preparedness and resilience. What can individuals, communities do to mitigate these risks from extreme weather?
Welcome back to our deep dive, on extreme weather.
Yeah.
We've gone from the science behind these storms to how they impact communities.
Right.
But now let's get practical, right? What can we actually do to prepare for these events?
That's the question, isn't it? It's easy to feel overwhelmed, I think.
Yeah.
We're talking about forces of nature here. They're powerful.
Right.
But there's a lot we can do, both as individuals and as a society, to get ready to build resilience.
Okay, so let's start with the individual level, those personal steps.
Okay.
What can people do to get prepared? The excerpts talked about emergency kits. What should those include, really?
An emergency kit, that's like your safety net. Think about what you would need to survive, let's say, 72 hours. No power, no water, no stores.
So like the basics.
Basics for sure.
Food, water, first aid kit.
You got it. Non-perishable food,
Yeah.
enough water for drinking and sanitation, first aid kit, well-stocked, with any meds you need. But then think beyond that.
Okay, beyond the basics, like what?
Okay, so a hand crank weather radio so you can stay informed, flashlights, extra batteries, blankets, warm clothes.
Right.
Oh, and don't forget a way to charge your phone.
Oh, yeah, that's important.
Portable power bank, really good investment these days.
And I imagine the stuff in your kit might change depending on where you live, right?
Yep.
What kind of weather's likely to hit.
Absolutely. Hurricane zone.
Right.
You'll want things like plywood to board up those windows,
Right.
sandbags for flood protection,
Right.
waterproof container for all those important documents, somewhere that gets really cold. Hand warmers, extra layers of clothing, maybe a sleeping bag rated for like sub-zero temps.
Okay, so a little prep can go a long way, it sounds like. But beyond the physical stuff, what about knowing your escape routes? Or how you're going to communicate with family?
Yeah, that stuff's critical. If you're in an area that might need to evacuate, you got to know those routes. Have a plan for where you're going, how you're going to get there.
Right, and make sure everybody in the family's on board.
Everyone's on the same page, yeah. And communication during an emergency, super important. Cell service might be out.
Oh, yeah, during a big storm for sure.
Have a backup, like a meeting place or one of those communication apps that works even without cell service.
I've seen those. Those are pretty cool. So that's a good start for individual preparedness. But zooming out a little, how can we as a society become more resilient, against extreme weather?
This is where it gets really interesting.
Mm.
We got to move beyond just reacting to disasters, right? We have to start focusing on how to reduce the risk before anything happens.
So like proactive stuff.
Proactive, exactly.
The excerpts mention like stronger building codes, better infrastructure.
Exactly. We need to build stuff that can stand up to these events, right? So that means updating building codes, stronger materials, better roofs, more protection against flooding.
Okay.
And it's not just new buildings. We got to retrofit the old ones too,
Right. Make them tougher.
make them tougher. And it's not just buildings, it's all that critical infrastructure.
Yeah, roads, bridges, the power grid, all of that.
The whole network, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
These systems are all connected, so if one goes down, it causes problems everywhere. We need to invest in making them tougher, more resilient, so they can handle these impacts, burying power lines to protect them from wind, designing bridges that can withstand those storm surges, that kind of thing.
The excerpts also talked about early warning systems being important.
Oh, those are critical.
Mm.
Critical for saving lives, reducing damage, and forecasting tech is getting better all the time. We can predict these events with more accuracy now.
Yeah.
But it's not just about having that information, right? It's about getting it to people in a way they can use so they can take action.
So it's clear communication, making it accessible, making sure everyone's in the loop.
Everybody, yeah.
What about things like, how we plan land use or zoning regulations? Can those help make us more resilient?
Absolutely. We got to think about where we build, how we build.
Yeah.
Avoiding those high-risk areas like floodplains or coastal zones that can reduce how vulnerable we are. And protecting those natural barriers like wetlands, dunes, those help buffer us against storm surge, flooding.
Right, yeah, like natural defenses. Sounds like there's a lot to consider, but also a lot we can do to create a safer, more resilient future.
There is. And remember, it's an ongoing process. It's not like you do it once and you're done, right? It's constant adapting, innovating, learning from what's happened in the past.
So if there's one big takeaway you want to leave our listeners with, what would it be?
I think it's this. We can't control the weather, no way. But we can control how we prepare for it, how we respond to it.
Right.
Understanding the risks, taking those proactive steps, working together as a community. That's how we build a more resilient future for ourselves and for generations to come.
That's a great message to end on. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into extreme weather. We hope you learned something, feel empowered to take action. Remember, knowledge is power, and we can weather any storm if we work together.